Good afternoon, and welcome to the Faculty Forum Online, where alumni can learn from MIT faculty about research and timely topics, and can ask questions live. I'm Judy Cole, the Alumni Association's EVP and CEO, and I will serve as the moderator. To participate, input a username and your location, and then type your question at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to answer as many questions as possible. Our guest today is James DiCarlo, head of MIT's Brain and Cognitive Sciences. Next month, you will have a chance to see Jim and 6 faculty members from his department in the Tech Day program, Unraveling the Workings of the Brain. That will be held on campus and webcast live on Saturday, June 8th. In a few weeks, you will be receiving instructions via email. Jim, thank you for joining us. Our theme today is the exciting new research being done here at MIT on the brain. Could you begin by describing the scope of this research?
Well, thank you for having me, first of all, and thank you for your listeners to come and hear what we're doing. I think it's helpful if I could start by orienting folks to what our department is about. When I say BCS, that stands for the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences, and the department was founded in 1964 as a department of psychology. And for those of you who remember at that time, in 1964, psychology, people would be talking about things like the id and the ego and the superego. But our founding department chair, Hans Lucas Teuber, had a vision at that time that we could understand the mind by studying the physicality of the brain. And that was a bold vision at the time, again, in that context. But as if I might say, that's now the vision of the entire field. And that's really what guides our department and that you'll hear more about today. It wasn't until 1993 that our department actually became part of the School of Science, and that helps to orient you to the fact that our department is quite young. So this is only 20 years ago that we were actually part of School of Science.
Where was it before that? Was it in Shaz?
Yes. Yeah.
Ah, okay.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt.
Okay. No, that's great. So we still have maintained this broad vision of the goal is to understand the mind all the way into the levels of the brain, all the way down to molecules. And it was only recently in the last decade, or a little over 10 years, that we were fortunate enough to be greatly enhanced by the formation of 2 great institutes, the McGovern Institute for Brain Research and the Picower Institute for Learning and Memory. And as those institutes got formed, that allowed us to move into a brand new building, Building 46 here at MIT. We now have 40 faculty labs in the department, all together in this premier center for brain science in the world. And so it's quite an exciting time for us to be now unified and working shoulder to shoulder together to go after some of these deep questions. And I want to orient your listeners to remind them that, again, our vision is quite broad. So we are interested in everything from genes, the genes that contain the information that give rise to how neurons get constructed. Neurons are the fundamental elements of the brain. How those neurons get wired together to form circuits within the brain. How they live in different parts of the brain or different brain regions that are working together to compute algorithms that are what we think are the basis of cognition and that ultimately give rise to the behavior, or what we call the mind. So we have scientists that work at all those different levels, all within this building, and that's, again, part of the grand vision of our department. And this is an intellectual mission that is centered naturally at BCS, at MIT. How does the brain give rise to the mind? But we can't do this alone. So we work closely with the biologists, the engineers, computer scientists, and even the linguists to try to collaborate on understanding this very sort of the human challenge of going all the way from the molecules of the brain to the mind. Really probably the great challenge in human history. And so that orients you to our department in the scope of MIT. I hope that as we go through the questions, we'll be able to talk about where we think our current gaps in understanding are and where the likely progress might be.
Thank you, Jim. That's a helpful context. Questions are coming in, and as we gather them, let me begin by asking you some of my own. Okay. Why is the basic science so important?
Judy, I'm really glad you asked that question because I maybe failed to mention that our department is really focused on fundamental mechanisms of how the brain works. And the reason that these are so important, we learn a lot from history. First of all, let me step back and say that we're all deeply interested in these questions that I'm calling questions of the mind. How does memory work? How do I perceive the world? How does language work? All of those questions are really questions of the mind. And those are deep basic science questions. They're deeply beautiful questions to all of us. All normal humans have those functions and are interested in those questions. So I think we're all naturally driven to them. So there's just a deep beauty to those questions that's important for all of us to study and MIT to lead in. The other reason is, of course, practical, that we think that our understanding of these mechanisms will have practical implications in the world. So some of the things that we would imagine the basic science leading to practical applications for are things like brain disorders. Many of you know that 1 in 100 children are now diagnosed with autism. Many of us have been affected by a relative with Alzheimer's. These conditions currently have no treatments, and they are becoming greater and greater weights on U.S. society, both emotionally and financially. So we believe that these have to be solved by a fundamental understanding of how the brain works to ultimately give rise to treatments for those kind of disorders. So that's one practical reason. Another practical reason is that the brain is really a remarkable computing device, and if we can understand how the brain computes, we might even be able to build technology that can surpass the brain. There's also applications that our basic science will lead to in things like better education. So as we learn how the brain learns, we might be able to better educate our kids and adults. These are all applied areas of interest. We could imagine as we understand brain circuits, we might be able to augment brain function by perhaps interacting with first disordered brains, folks that have lost a limb, say new prosthetics, folks that have lost sight, restored vision through prosthetics, and ultimately, if we dream interacting even with normal brains as we learn to interact with the brain, that we might augment ourselves. So these are all the things that keep us all excited about working on the brain. You can see those are many different things, but I want to remind everybody that there's many things that are likely to come from basic research that we just can't predict. And the reason we know this is because we know this because of other fields. So, you know, the Rad Lab here at MIT didn't know that their basic science now leads to us doing brain scans on humans that was enabled by their work. They had no way to predict that research would now enable our research. Similarly, studies in Bob Horvitz's lab here at MIT in biology on how cells decide to die now 30 years later leads to great new drugs for cancer. So these were unpredictable things that we need to keep in mind, that if we study the basic phenomena, they will lead to many things that we can imagine, as I outlined, but many, many things that we can't yet imagine.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's the importance of places like MIT in the world, because we can contribute to that basic science that enables other things. So here's a question. Is the brain, you mentioned understanding how the brain computes, is the brain a computer?
Right, that's another great question, and one I love to discuss with my students. So the answer to that question is both yes and no. So it's yes in the sense that the brain is ultimately an information processing device. It takes data, it somehow manipulates that data to make sense of what's in the world. It builds internal models of what's out there in the world so that it can guide behavior in a way that allows it to do well in the world. And everything I just described is information manipulation, which is what computers are trying to do as well. So in that sense, the brain is a computer, and it's important for us to think about how you might solve these computational problems. And this is where we get collaborations with engineers and computer scientists that are busy trying to build machines to solve those problems. Their work on that inspires those are hypotheses that we can test. Does the brain work this way? Is it work in an entirely new way? So thinking about the brain as a computer allows us to connect to that kind of science in important ways that drive the science forward. The other way the brain is like a computer, it's important to think about it, is that they share an idea of what I would call levels of abstraction. So the brain is made of billions of elements called neurons and connected to each other. Now, computers have many, many, many elements called transistors that those of you who know computers work on. But somehow the assembly of those transistors gives rise to the performance of your computer or your iPhone in your pocket. But there's a very large gap between understanding how transistors work and how your iPhone is able to do what it does. And similarly for the brain, we have these neurons, we have this beautiful set of things that we call the mind, and there's a very large gap in our understanding of what exists between those levels of abstraction. And I'm giving this as an analogy so that it helps your listeners to think about what we would need to do to reverse engineer a device as complicated as an iPhone or a computer, and also to give us some guidance as to how we might go about that. So these are all ways that it's like a computer. There are many ways the brain's not like a computer. For instance, it's much slower than a computer. Each of its elements only works at 1,000 hertz. So that's 1 million times slower than the clock speed on your computer, 1 million times slower. But the neurons are much more connected than the elements of a computer. So it trades off the speed of processing for being much more connected. It's also much more malleable. You know, as you and I sit here and talk, our brains are changing all the detailed connections of the synapses. You're remembering this. These are being laid down in the synapses in your brain and my brain. Your computer is just sitting there idle, and it's not as plastic as our brain. So the brain is much more malleable. And one of the reasons of the brain is not like a computer is that there's many things it just does better than a computer. And that's, again, fascinating to many of us that are interested in using what the brain does to inspire new computing technology. And the areas where the brain exceeds a computer are very important to focus on in that regard.
So what are some of those areas where the brain exceeds a computer?
So examples would be our ability to extract information in the world, for instance, objects. So this is a problem my lab works on, to be able to recognize objects in very cluttered or difficult environments. So that's a problem where computers are getting close, but the brain is still better. The ability to reach dexterously and pick up an object with a dexterity that far exceeds that of current robots. That's something that our brains and bodies do well. The ability to interact with others in a way that I can build a model of what's in your head and you build a model of what's in my head. These are important to our social awareness and in even the discussion we're having right now. The use of language and constructing the rules of how we construct language and convey meaning to others. These are just some of the examples in which our brains are currently better than current machines.
So let me take a question from an alumna. Anne in Cambridge asks, how does the brain sort through so much sensory input and find order in it? For example, how well do we understand the neuronal structures and the processes that allow for visual recognition of objects?
Okay, great. Thank you, Anne, for that question. Let me try to answer that question with posing things in the visual system. So how does the brain sort through sensory input? There are many types of sensory input we get: auditory input, tactile input, but visual input is the one that's most familiar to us. And it's also what my lab and a number of labs in the building work on. So we know from previous work which brain regions, which structures in the brain, which physical parts of it are most important to processing information. For instance, information about, is this a face? Do I recognize this person? We know what parts of the brain are important, but we don't yet know the important details of how they compute the information. So one thing that's important to keep in mind is when you look at an image, like an image of your face, that's just a pattern of little dots of light that's striking my eye, just like your camera would receive. The information about, oh, it's a face, and this person's name is Judy, that information is something that my brain has to extract from that pixel pattern. And I'm just reminding folks of this because it's easy to to have the intuition that it's so easy to see, but it's something that we do effortlessly. We don't store patterns of photographs. We don't store photographs in our head just like you take pictures with your iPhone and collect them all up. We somehow store a transformed representation of those photographs that has more to do with meaning, for instance, that your name or that you're a person or the expressions that you have. That's called semantic content or high-level content in the image. And we have a lot of machinery in our head to help us do that. And again, we know where that machinery lives, but we don't yet know in detail how it works. And part of the reason we don't know that detail is we can't yet build machines that can emulate it and do as well as we can. So one of the things that we do is try to study the neurons along those different pathways and understand how they're taking that pixel information, those camera images, and transform them to other patterns of information that supports this. And I'd be happy to discuss that in more detail, but that's the broad overview of where we are.
I have two short follow-up questions, and then we'll take another one. The first one is, so is that what allows us to, I don't know the right words to put around it in terms of the processor in the brain, is that what allows us to recognize a person even when we haven't seen them in a long time and they may have changed or aged or their hair is a different color or whatever?
Right.
And so that's where we're able to pull that information even though the pixel layout is different?
That's a great example. I mean, this problem is called the problem of invariance. So an example that's even more easy to grasp is that I can see you, even if you change the lighting in the room, or that you move a little bit, or you get further away. All of those change the image on my retina with my camera on my eyes, yet I still can recognize your face. That ability to recognize you across those they're called identity preserving image changes, is something that brains do remarkably well, yet machines are not so good at yet. And so that's called the invariance problem, and it's a core to what our brains do almost automatically. We don't have to think about it. As you said, when I'd see you later, I could still recognize you across those changes within some limits.
And is that sort of the foundation of CAPTCHAs? That eyes can recognize them better than machines?
Well, that's an example of a transformation of a particular known pattern that our brains are better at dealing with than
decoding.
Machines. So that's one example.
All right, so the last question I have to ask, and then I'll get back to the alumni question. So you see these commercials all the time on TV about lumosity and claiming to regenerate neuronal connections. Is there any truth to that?
I'm not sure I've seen the commercials.
It's this computer website where you go and you play these games that they feel like games, but they supposedly improve memory and flexibility and speed and all these different dimensions of brain function by actually regenerating or building new neuronal connections.
Right. So first thing to keep in mind is anytime we learn anything new that we're going to remember for a long period of time, remember we believe that that's embedded in the physicality of the brain, right? So that's, again, the guiding vision of the field. So there's got to be some changes in your brain when you learn anything. So this is something that is true in the sense that if you say, I learned a video game and I got better at it, whatever the video game is, your brain has changed in some way. So that's, of course, true.
That's by definition.
Well, almost by definition. If you believe in what's called a materialistic view, that the brain, as our mind, is arising from those synaptic connections, which our field does, then that has to be true. Now, the important question for that company would be, does your particular way of training do better at training connections than another way? And there's where I think they're on a little bit more of a shaky ground. So in some sense it's true, but is there a better way to train your brain that could we discover that way through neuroscience? Ultimately, yes, and I alluded to education, but we're still in our infancy of being able to take what we know about how the synapses change, the connections between the brain, and translate it into here's exactly what we should be doing to accelerate things like learning. Those ideas are correct in spirit, but in practice, there's still much work to be done.
Thank you. MP in Charlotte asks, what work is being done in the area of neuroplasticity?
Well, so neuroplasticity refers to, again, the malleability of the brain. And again, the key points of malleability of the brain, if you think of the billions of neurons in the brain and the trillions of synapses that connect them, the little connections between one neuron and another, the points where one neuron connects to another is called a synapse, and those can be changed with learning and experience. And that's where that's thought to be the fundamental element of plasticity, or neuroplasticity as you call it, is as you learn something new, the weights or the molecular details of that synapse change that give rise to a change in how strongly one neuron talks to another. And if you imagine trillions of these changing in a coordinated way, that's how we think we lay down things like memories. So the question was, what is the latest research in neuroplasticity? So almost anybody working on the brain is fundamentally connected to this question. Almost every lab in the building has some bearing on that. The question could be focused by some folks, again, working on the details of the molecular, the synaptic changes that are going on. Others thinking about how do those changes amount to a change in the way one neuron fires in response to the input of other neurons. Those are there are many different levels of answer to this question that all could be tagged with the word neuroplasticity. Even the example you gave of luminosity is a claim about neuroplasticity at the behavioral level, right? So,
absolutely.
So to answer that question requires understanding, again, at multiple levels, and that's, again, different levels, different types of expertise, and what our department is organized around being able to answer that question at all those different levels.
So it sort of sounds as if the short answer to the question is what work is being done around the area of neuroplasticity? Lots in every part of the department.
Well, yes. Again, almost everybody's work is connected in some way to neuroplasticity.
Yeah. So Rick in Andover, Massachusetts asks, is the brain hardwired for language?
Okay. So, well, that's sort of getting into a topic area that the linguists might have something to say
have
about.
An opinion about, yeah.
Right. This is the deal. And again, I should have said this at the beginning. We're a young field, so many of the answers to these questions will be, well, we still don't fully know the answers to these questions, but there is some evidence and belief that there are some innate abilities that come that are associated with language and concept formation. There is also evidence that those can also be changed with experience. So the answer to all of these, is it built in or is it not, every time you look closely at them, turns out to be a mixture of both. So the jury is still out, and it comes on definitions of exactly how you want to define language. But there are many almost anything that you study in the brain, including language, would have two inputs from both what we'd call nature, what you're born with, and nurture, your experience. And it's the combination of those that is always at play. So it's hard to always boil these questions down to simple answers. That's one of the things that we've learned in a number of fields. And so the important work is now understanding the what you might call details, but are important details of how experience interacts with the innate structure that you're built with. And that is thought to be important to everything from developmental disorders to how kids learn, and it's the combination of those that makes it both a challenging problem and an interesting problem.
Absolutely. So Lynn in California asks, what are your thoughts regarding studies of the cardiac brain and enteric brain neural networks in the heart and gut and in the gut?
So I think she might be referring to the fact that of course, there are neurons that aren't in the brain itself or even the central nervous system, but there are neurons that reside in ganglia and other neural networks around the gut and the heart. And a lot of these are associated with making the gut move or making the heart pump, right? They need control systems as well. So maybe I could you restate the question of what she's hoping for?
Well, it seems to me that I'm imagining that, you can tell me if I'm right or not. I'm imagining that those neural networks are controlled by something in the brain that is actually the master controller of all the physical functions of the body. So they're sort of, they're like remote neural pathways or something. Is that a pretty basic understanding?
I think that's right. So there's multiple levels of control. For instance, the heart, you might remember from movies from biology, you take the heart out of an animal, the heart will still beat, right? So it has a local controller to make it beat, but it can be overridden by another level controller to make it beat faster, right? And a lot of that is autonomic, meaning we're not even aware of it, but it's controlled by parts of our brain that have to make it. We run faster, our brain's got to be harder. We eat some food, our gut has to work harder. So a lot of that is below our level of awareness, but the controllers are at multiple levels there. I'm not sure if I'm answering her question, but there's a multi-level control. And as you built a robot, you would build it in the same way. You know, it would have a control that might be local, and then you would have another level of control to override it. And many of the roboticists have kind of advocated that idea. Don't think about control as being a central thing, but at multiple levels of control. Many here at MIT have pushed that point of view.
That explains a lot about the way MIT is organized. Wendy in New Jersey asks, I'm interested in the practical applications, specifically how to help normal, healthy adults perform better, achieve more of what they want. We all seem to have multiple brains or brain components that are often at odds with each other. How can we better integrate these parts and get them working together to achieve our aims?
It's a good question. It's a challenging question. So she's asking a practical question of how when we say multiple brains working together, of course, she really only has one physical brain in her head, but she's imagining competing tasks, for instance, that how do we best organize our thoughts, so to speak, to be more efficient? I think that's the spirit of what she's asking. I mean, I'll sort of go out on a limb here and say Many of these things can be studied without getting into the physicality of the brain. You can imagine, a program where we try to investigate, well, what if I was educated in this way or that way? I mean, there are fields that you can study those things just empirically without fully understanding the details underneath, and just ask a question of, does this work better than that? But we also believe, again, that if we can understand more detail, for instance, how the brain does task switching between tasks, and this is something that is studied in our department. This is called switching of, for instance, visual attention, other types of attention, that an understanding of that switching might better inform that kind of question as to how do we better integrate, if I need to do 3 tasks, should I do them? How often should I switch among them? What do we know about neuroscience that would tell us how to switch among them? But I would say we don't yet know, we can't yet translate what we do know. We do know there is task switching. We can see neural phenomena of it in the brain, but we can't yet translate that into a strong practical change in what this Lynn, I think, should do with her life. That's our goal, but we have a lot of basic science that has to be done to get to that kind of goal.
Okay, I think we may be getting close, so this might be our last question. Norm in Massachusetts asks, does your department have any joint research on learning with MITx or edX? I think I might rephrase it as, can you tell us about the joint research that you all are doing on learning with edX and MITx?
That's an exciting area. As you might know, edX and MITx have a whole center devoted to how do we, as people learn, there will be data that will come in from that on how well they learn, and that's an exciting area for many of us. And some of our faculty are involved in wanting to look at those data and see what we can learn from it. We're not the only department that's involved in that. But you can see that you can do very interesting things there without even, there's no physicality of the brain. You're just studying the statistics of how people learn. And again, that is a useful level. You can infer something about the mind from that, and some of our faculty work on that. So we are, as you know, MIT and edX are really just getting rolling, but this is going to be a great set of data for understanding how people learn that we believe will ultimately connect back to the brain. But the first levels of understanding will be done with statistics of how people are learning under those different learning protocols. And it'll be a wealth of data that not just our department, but other departments at MIT will take, I think, great advantage of to improve learning in the future.
Although I can't imagine exactly what it will look like, I have high confidence that that research will lead to a paradigm shift in education somewhere.
I hope so. And one of the things we like to talk about in our department is really a science of education. It's very difficult to do science without controlled experiments. And some of these have been done in education, but to have this group of kids are going to be trained this way, and this group, and we're going to randomize this, and that's not something that you can easily do, as for many reasons you can imagine for humans. But in this case, some of this will happen more naturally. We'll have more natural experiments that we can control in effect, and this will allow us, I believe, to actually do some science around how to best educate. And I think that's exciting as we can do science in that area. And I think that's what you're referring to, is a paradigm shift as to here is a science of education, which will ultimately connect to the physicality of the brain, but will make great strides even before we make those deeper connections all the way down to neurons and synapses.
Okay, I think we are almost out of time. So on behalf of the MIT Alumni Association, thank you, Jim, for your insights today, and thanks to our viewing audience for joining us. Be sure to join us again on June 8th for the live webcast of Tech Day's in-depth discussion with Jim and some of the remarkable faculty in his department. In the meantime, we encourage you to continue this discussion on our blog, Slice of MIT, by following the link that will appear on your screen. Please join us again in June for the next chat with an MIT faculty member.
Thank you.